Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Limbach, producer of the Pharma Voice Webcast Network, and I'll be your moderator today. Welcome to our event entitled Selecting and Implementing Mobile Sensors to Collect Clinical Trial Endpoint Data, brought to you by Pharma Voice in partnership with our good friends at Signant Health. We have an outstanding crowd today with executives from all over the industry, and this has quickly become one of our more popular webinars of the past 12 months, so thank you for investing the time to register and attend. We will do our very best to make it worth your while. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acquaint you with a few features of our webinar technology. Your GoToWebinar control panel will give you access to several functions. If you can hear me but are experiencing problems logging in to see the slides, you may want to try logging in using a different browser, and we recommend the latest versions of Internet Explorer, Firefox, and Chrome. Tablets and smartphones also work if you have the free GoToMeeting mobile app. For any other issues, use the robust help options from your control panel, or visit gotowebinar.com, or you can send us a message using the questions function in the control panel, and we'll do our best to help you out. We're taking questions from the audience today, and you can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during the presentation. Just type your question into the questions text area in your control panel and click the send button. The Q&A session will be after the formal presentation. We'll have one audience poll during the presentation, so get ready to answer that. And at the conclusion of the presentation, as I said, we will do a Q&A session. You are going to be seeing and hearing a great deal of useful information today, and you don't have to memorize everything during the live event or take copious notes, because we are recording this webinar. We will send you a link to the on-demand archive in a day or two so you can review the event at your leisure. Now that we're through with the housekeeping details, let's dive into the program. We have a very knowledgeable panel of experts with us today to help us understand the complexities of using mobile sensors and wearables in clinical research. It's a growing trend, but there are many issues to examine before you can take advantage of these new technologies. So, introducing our panelists, we're happy to welcome Bill Byram, PhD, Vice President, Product Strategy and Innovation at Signant Health. Bill's joined by Jeremy Wyatt, President at Actigraph, and Richard Sutherland, Product Manager at Signant Health. Based on the excellent turnout today, our topic is clearly an area of interest, and it promises to be an extremely informative session, and I'm looking forward to it. So Bill is going to start things off today, and we'll hear from our other experts as well. Immediately after the presentation, as I said, we'll have a Q&A. So we want to do a poll question first, so if we can advance to that slide. We'd like to know which statement best describes your experience integrating eCOA with sensors and wearables in your clinical trials. And this will just give us a better idea of who's in the audience. So we'll give you a moment to select one of these four responses. Just click on the circle to the left of the possible answers. And I can see them streaming in already. We'll give everybody another moment to make their selection. Okay, let's say last call. All right, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So we've got a pretty wide range here. People are from all of these four possible areas. Bill, do you want to weigh in, and what do you think of our audience today?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, well, our audience are splendid, of course, but in terms of their responses, yeah, I think that's what I was expecting to see. You know, actually quite high, nearly 20% already integrating eCOA with sensor data, so that's really interesting. And quite a lot of people either considering doing this or just seeking information. So that's great, and that gives us a good picture for the folks that are online. So thanks for answering that.
All right, let's put away the poll and we can start the presentation.
Great, and Dan, yeah, I'll start off from here then. And so thanks again, everybody, for joining. My name is Bill Byram. I'm the VP of Product Strategy and Innovation at Signant Health. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, and I hope you find it interesting. So, you know, I'm going to kick off with a small section just looking at how we select mobile sensors for clinical trials, and some of the work we need to do to validate the clinical endpoints that we might derive from them. And then I'm going to hand over to Jeremy Wyatt, who's the president of Actigraph, who's going to talk a little bit more and drill into sleep and activity measurement using the devices that they have. And then finally, Rich Sutherland, is a key member of our product team here at Signant. He's going to talk about the integration with eCOA and actigraphy, and a little bit of information about that. So if you go to the next slide, Chris. So let me kick off then by just talking about selecting mobile sensors and validating endpoints. So if you go to the next one. Yeah, not all sensor devices that we connect with are wearables. So we tend to use the term mobile sensor as a more sort of broader umbrella description. And a mobile sensor is something that detects and measures physical or chemical information and translates that into some sort of digital signal that can then be measured and reported. And we're seeing growing importance in the use of reliable, high-performance sensors, not just in the health and wellness area, where we're seeing enormous interest, health monitoring, personal fitness, for example, but also, of course, in clinical research. If you go to the next slide, Chris. And here's an example of an early mobile sensor. So this is the first Holter monitor, and that is Dr. Holter himself demonstrating it. And back in 1947, of course, the technology was a little different. And here, he had a 38-kilogram backpack that was used to house the device and also the transmitter to be able to wirelessly broadcast that first ECG signal. So you can imagine that, perhaps someone who didn't have a heart problem before wearing that 38-kilogram backpack may well now have a heart problem. If we move on to what we do now and what's available now, this miniaturization of sensors and circuitry means that things are a lot smaller, of course, and a lot more usable to use in things like clinical trials. And so we've got a number of different types of sensors that we're interested in: external devices like weighing scales or spirometers, wearable devices like activity and sleep monitors, and of course we'll talk about those with Jeremy in just a moment. Even the sensors in our smartphones can be used to collect health-related data, so measuring things like activity or even measuring tremor in a Parkinson's patient. Implantable devices, so these might be things like cardiac arrhythmia monitors, things that actually put inside the body, or things that are swallowed, ingestible devices, like medication tags, like the Proteus pill, for example. If you go to the next slide, Chris. So whilst there is this proliferation, particularly in the consumer industry, of these devices, particularly around health and wellness, we don't see us using them in enormous scale in pharmaceutical clinical trials. And what are the barriers to that? I think perhaps one of them centers from the fact that there isn't necessarily specific regulatory guidance around the use of wearables. There's a lot of guidance around how we develop clinical endpoints and how we measure things appropriately in clinical trials, but perhaps nothing specific around wearables. And some of the questions that we ask as researchers are, how do we select a device that's appropriate for clinical research and one that the regulators will accept the data from? What standards do we follow when we're implementing a wearable or a mobile sensor in a clinical trial? And then what evidence do we need to support the endpoints that we might derive from the data from that device? So if we go to the next slide, Chris. So just as an example around the lack of standards, this was a piece of work I did a couple of years ago with a researcher at Strathclyde University in Glasgow, and we looked at COPD studies and activity monitoring in COPD using activity monitors. And we were trying to derive some standards for how we might implement these approaches in clinical trials. So we looked at 76 different studies. If you go to the next slide, Chris. And of these studies, there really was a huge variation in methodology. So 27 different activity monitors were used and reported. lots of them placed in different parts of the body, many on the waist and the hips, some on the arm, the ankle, the wrist, the lower back, some even in the pocket or on the shoe. And patients were studied for different lengths of time, ranging from 2 days to 26 weeks. Go to the next one. And then, how they managed the data actually was poorly reported in many of the studies, but again, a lot of variability. So how did they define a valid day? And a valid day meaning, did the patient wear the device for long enough to get a good picture of their activity on that particular day? And definitions of a valid day range from 6 to 24 hours. How many valid days would be needed to get a good picture of their overall activity? Again, that ranged from 3 to 7 days across the papers that we looked at. How did they identify if a patient wasn't wearing the device? Now, some of the devices, and particularly the ones that are in contact with the skin, have got wear detectors, so you can actually automatically know if somebody's got it on or they haven't. But of course, they're not always worn on the wrist. Sometimes they're worn on a waist belt, and that way you have to figure out by looking at the data whether you think somebody's worn the device or not. And in general, most authors reported looking at a 60-minute period where there was no activity recorded on the device was probably the most common approach to doing that. Now, if you're working in children, perhaps that needs to be a shorter interval. If you're working in very sedentary, perhaps elderly adults, maybe that needs to be a longer period. And then what do you do about missing data? Days when the patient wasn't wearing it, or hours when they should have been wearing it to make up a valid day. Again, this wasn't reported. If you go to the next slide. And then finally, the clinical endpoints that they reported in those studies. There were over 80 different endpoints that they analysed across these 76 studies, and they looked at different aspects of activity, from sort of measures of total activity like total steps, to intensity measures, to postural transitions, even the number of times people are getting up from sitting down. So again, if you go to the next slide, Chris, really what we're seeing there is no well-trodden path, at least in the scientific literature, to help us with a standard around implementation. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why there's a little bit of a barrier to that, although companies like Actigraph with their scientific expertise certainly provide a lot of expertise to help define an appropriate implementation strategy for their wearable devices. So think about that other barrier around how we select something that would be acceptable to regulators. So those are the sorts of questions. Will the data be acceptable if I put it into a submission for a new drug application? Will the sensor be acceptable to patients? Will they wear it? Does the sensor provide output that enables me to derive an endpoint that really does measure the concept of interest that my study protocol requires? And is the accuracy, precision, reliability, is it going to be accurate enough to provide a measure suitable for clinical research? If you go to the next slide. And there's some considerations that we've listed here on this slide. And firstly, at the top there, the regulatory classification. So whether the device has a 510K or a CE mark, it really isn't the question, and it's quite acceptable, I think, to use devices that don't have market clearance, but that do have the characteristics of a fit-for-purpose device. And how would we define a fit-for-purpose device? Well, probably look at these other categories. So firstly, is it safe? And usually, of course, the manufacturer provides data to support the safety of a device, and particularly if it's worn with the skin, that's going to be an important thing to look at. But then suitability, and in particular, suitability with reference to the patient population, but also with reference to the specific study protocol that we're looking at. So does the battery life or the storage capacity of the device meet the needs of the study? If I want to study something for 4 weeks, I'm going to need to be able to store at least 4 weeks data, for example. Should the patient be able to see the data? So if I'm doing a diabetes study and my device is a blood glucose meter, then yes, they actually need to see the blood glucose values because it's part of their own self-monitoring, and they may be even adjusting their insulin dose based upon some of the values that they see. But if it's an activity monitor, what I want to protect against is for that device becoming part of the intervention of the study. So, if somebody puts an activity monitor on me, I'm going to be looking at the steps and probably starting to set myself targets to improve the number of steps per day. And I don't really want that as part of a clinical trial. I would rather be simply passively collecting the data without introducing another intervention effect, a placebo effect. Other questions around suitability might be around, for example, control of the firmware that sits on the device or the software that's being used. And when we look at consumer devices, perhaps Fitbit would be a good example. Do we have control over the firmware, or when a new firmware version is rolled out, will it just be sent out to all the users and we'll have no control? And if that piece of firmware actually affects how it calculates steps, for example, that could give us a problem if that's done in the middle of a clinical trial. And then as we think about the patient population, we clearly need to see is this device, this sensor, acceptable for use in that patient population, and maybe we'd look at doing some acceptability testing with patients for that. Some aspects we want to consider are things like the form factor. So, if I'm looking at young adults, is this something they're going to, if it's a wearable device for example, is it something they're going to be willing to wear? If it's a population of, obese patients, perhaps, is the waistband going to be long enough for them to use? Or if it's a frail elderly population, is the wristband going to be tight enough to stay on their wrist comfortably? And then finally, analytical validity. So this is really important in terms of, again, selecting a fit for purpose sensor. So does it have adequate and satisfactory accuracy, reliability, and precision? And do we have data to support that? Is it valid for use in that specific patient population? So an example here, again, if we go back to activity and walking, many of the activity monitors and their algorithms that detect things like steps will be developed based on healthy volunteers and healthy populations. And if we now want to use that same device in a study with Parkinson's patients who have quite a different way of walking, they tend to shuffle rather than perhaps walk in the way that other people do. Is that algorithm still suitable in its ability to detect steps? And another piece of analytical validity it's just really a vendor characteristic. Is the vendor manufacturing to quality processes so that, if we can understand the reliability of one batch of their devices, will that reliability continue throughout the new manufacturing process of new batches? You go to the next one, please, Chris. There's quite a few consortia across our industry who are looking at these things. The EPRO consortium published an article back in Value in Health last year, which is a useful reference to some of this stuff. The City Group, again, does some super work around here, and a lot of that's online. So it's a good reference for, again, how to select a suitable device for trials. And the Drug Information Association, so a team that I'm leading through the study endpoints community, are working on an evidence dossier to support endpoints derived from mobile sensors. So that's not yet published. And then finally, the Digital Medicine Society, again, are doing research on this. So a lot of work being done, which I think will help to drive us forward in the way that we adopt these into our studies. And just finally then, Chris, if you move on to the next one. So just the final thing I wanted to touch on is how we define and derive clinical endpoints when we're using a wearable or a mobile sensor. And to touch on this, if you go back to that COPD example that was published and use that as an example, but this was work that I presented at the PRO Consortium meeting workshop last year. But it's work that DIA study endpoints community are responsible for, and particularly Mark Walton as part of that team. So you go to the next slide. So if we think first about how we kind of construct a model for an endpoint, a conceptual framework, we need to start with measuring meaningful aspects of health. So if we go back to COPD as an example, a patient might say, yeah, I want to be able to walk my grandchild to and from school. That would be something that was meaningful to me in terms of activity. Or they might say, I want to do more around the house. And both of those have different aspects of health that we're looking at. Perhaps one's physical activity related, the other might be more around sedentary behavior. If you go click again, please, Chris. So based on that, we can start to develop concepts of interest. So let's think about the physical activity one, and this short walk, being able to conduct that short walk to and from school. So maybe a concept of interest would be around purposeful walking episodes, however we define those. And maybe it's the number of those episodes or the time we spend in those bouts of purposeful walking. And so to develop an endpoint, an endpoint might be the number of bouts of activity of purposeful walking. And we might define purposeful walking as a stepping rate of 60 steps a minute for a duration of at least 2 minutes. And that might be our endpoint. And really only when we've figured out what that endpoint is, can we define the best way to measure it. Because we might be choosing a patient diary to do this. It might be a patient reported outcome measure. But in this case, certainly a mobile sensor that's able to detect steps and also the timing of those steps is going to give us the data that we need to measure that endpoint accurately. And so this starts to tell us a little bit about the kind of evidence we need to generate to support the use of that clinical endpoint. So we start at the top there with the mobile sensor. It's the analytic validity that we talked about before. Is it accurate and precise and reliable in measuring and detecting steps? The endpoint properties around that particular endpoint. So do we understand its interpretability? Do we know what a meaningful change is? Is it sensitive to detect a change? Does the endpoint actually measure the concept of interest? So that's really construct validity. And does the concept of interest really measure the meaningful aspect of health? Well, I guess that's content validity. And what this all sort of stems from is patient-focused research. It's finding out from patients what's actually meaningful to them. And going back to that example with COPD, the research, there was no example of the 76 studies that I looked at where the clinicians, where the authors reported doing any patient research to find out what was important to those patients before defining the endpoints they wanted to study. I think usually the endpoints are probably defined by the researchers themselves. And so as we think about more patient-focused drug development approaches, it's going to be more important to go back to the patients as we start to develop these endpoints. So I think that's a good way to move on, in fact, to Jeremy's piece, because we've started to talk already about activity, and Jeremy's going to dig a little deeper into measurement of sleep and activity in trials. So over to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and thanks again to everyone for attending today. And Bill, as you hand off, I just want to say how much I appreciate your work in this industry. And as we look at the survey, the kind of diversity of implementation that we've seen here, and then as we look at your study across those COPD studies, the variability across the studies of how to progress forward certainly lends itself well to confusion. And so, this group and others are lucky to have Signet and yourself as well to help guide through that kind of complexities that are there. So I don't want to take us too far off of that. In fact, I want to talk about that validation piece, and I know the audience has questions about that, but I thought it may be helpful if I just sort of segued into the actigraph component and maybe just a very short slide or two about, the justification around why we think this is important. Sure, I think we want to implement ECOA and wearables in clinical trials or sensors in clinical trials, but what's the why? Again, let's remind ourselves about what that is. So this slide just kind of points to the decreasing efficiency of clinical drug development. And so we're looking at here is the new molecular entities per $1 billion of R&D spend over the past 50 years has decreased opposite of Moore's law. It's just continued to drop. So although we've had technology, prevalence of technology, developed over those times, we continue to see this drop in efficiency. And the tough centers telling us that it takes about 8 years, it costs about $2 billion to develop a drug. And certainly a lot of discussions around how can we do better? How can we get more specific with what we're trying to tease out of patients and help them in such a way that that we can make their lives better. But certainly we need improvement here. This slide sort of speaks to how digital measures as we move forward can help us accomplish that. I think our current approach to measuring disease outcomes has been just what we can do in front of the patient or with the patient in the clinic. Albert Einstein, who certainly helped us understand our universe better, said, hey, you know, we can only see 5% of our universe. The rest of it, the 95%, remains invisible to us. And that's certainly the approach that we see in our drug development process. I mean, most of the time we're evaluating the progress or the efficacy of this drug in clinic. You know, we're doing it with kind of face-to-face with a doctor, or maybe using some subjective scale like the MDS Unified Parkinson's Scale or the 6-minute walk test. And these are certainly beneficial for giving us some baselines. But I think, as we've said with the Einstein example, about 95% of what the patient is doing or experiencing in their lives is happening outside of the clinical setting. And so we find ourselves sort of beholden to these assays that don't give us a lot of visibility into truly, you know, as Bill said, are we really helping the patient? Is it effective for the patient? Is it valuable to them? But we have an opportunity with wearables to get at a better picture of that. And so we're certainly excited to take that into the next level. Just a slide here, just a short slide on the Actigraph and who we are. We've got several customers that are, I'm sure, on the webinar, but Actigraph's history is in the academic research. And so you'll see most of our background is in working with some of these longitudinal studies that I'm showing on the screen here. That's given us a great perspective on how to get at the meaning behind the data rather than just collecting the data for the purposes of collecting the data. Some of these studies you may be familiar with. The NHAT study is starting here in the next 8 to 12 months. That's the aging study sponsored by NIH. Of course, we've been a part of the NHANES studies in the past, and some of these others that really take a look at health across a population, across time. And that helps give us a good perspective when we implement methods to look at that data and how does it apply to a disease state. Certainly helps us look through that lens. Some of the therapeutic areas that we've been involved with are enumerated on the right. And of course, there are more that I'm not showing, but we've been involved in studies that touch on all of these. So to hit on Bill's slide, he talked a lot about, you know, what does it look like to select a wearable sensor? And I think a lot of times we get caught up in that, and I don't want to make it too complicated. I think that certainly we think we need a wearable, and we look, and there's so many of them around. But just to mirror what Bill said, what we have seen is, you know, when we're talking to procurement, they think they need a wearable, but in fact, what we find is what we actually need is a supporting platform to make sure that we're getting that data in such a way that we can actually use the data later. And so Actigraph sells a tool called Centerpoint, and that tool has been very beneficial in helping us ensure that we meet all the logistics requirements, that we meet all the validation requirements that we need to meet to ensure that at the end of a study, we've got some quality data. And so I've enumerated a few things in here that maybe we don't think of right off the top of our head, but fit for use wearables, Bill talked about that, of course. And we make our own wearables here at Actigraph because we haven't found any that are necessarily fit for use in all clinical studies that make sense, but certainly there are others out there. Remote capture at the bottom of raw data, I think it's important, and I'll talk a little bit about unprocessed raw data in a moment, but it's important to get at that data in as near real time as possible. Remembering back to our first slide and the efficiency of the trial, if we can detect some signals in that trial early and either stop the study early if we think it's not going to be effective or press on in a different way, then we should do that. We should begin to take advantage of that technology in real time to do that. And then, of course, site training, deployment logistics. Are we getting devices to the right sites on time? But some of the main challenges that we've found are listed here across the bottom: logistics and validation, and then big data storage and data transfers. As Actigraph begins to work with Signet in this process, and we'll hear from Richard in just a moment about that, we'll find that that complex piece of actually getting this data and getting it in the proper way can be overcome with the proper integrations with your eCOA platform. As we look at what do the regulatory agencies expect from us, I think it's a little broader than just, hey, do you have a wearable or you're collecting data? We get questions all the time around, you know, how and when is the data being transferred? We want to know, is there any tampering happening with the data? How often is the data being collected? Is it often enough, or is it consecutive enough to actually have valuable meaning? How valid is that method? Have you tested out and assured that it's going to be effective and then it's going to function in the study per the protocol you've designed? How should we handle missing data? Do we have visibility on missing data? Was it not there because we lost battery, lost power, or did it get lost in transfer? How did that happen? Or are there some important signals that we're missing because it's not there? And so on. So I think it's important to paint this picture of, hey, it's more than, again, just a wearable. There are aspects that we're going to be expected to uphold around accuracy, around concept and of use for the study. And so your agencies, FDA, EMA, they're going to ask these questions. And so I think it's important that we think about how do we properly prepare to answer those. So we're often asked, you know, about validation methods for this data. How do you get at validating that data and ensuring that you've got a clear path to a submission? So I want to just outline 3 approaches that we have seen used effectively in clinical research. At the outset, before I go through these, I would like to say that don't let me scare you off. I think that we talk about this in terms of ecosystems and a holistic approach, but it can sound overwhelming and complicated. I think if I can just encourage someone on the call today to get started and take that first step, I think what you'll see is you may not get it right the first time. You may not have every answer to all of those questions I just showed, but certainly you've got a plan, and moving forward and knowing what you need to do at the next step is crucial. And so as we look at these validation methods that I'm going to go through here, this is what we see every day. We'll get a call from a small biopharma that's interested in using actigraphy for a clinical study, and they'll say, hey, we just want to get started. Well, how do we do that? One of the first ways that we see that happening is that they'll go through and cherry pick some existing literature. So actigraph has been involved, as I said, in over 100 therapeutic areas, different research studies around those therapeutic areas, and somewhere on the order of 3,500 peer-reviewed publications that reference different outcomes and different approaches to measuring that data. That's a lot of data to start from, and so you don't have to start from ground zero. Let's go out and see what relates to my study. How close can I get to my concept of interest, as Bill mentioned? How close can I get to my population? The pros around that are that the evidence exists there, and it can usually support sort of your first step in your early phase clinical study, but maybe the evidence doesn't always necessarily directly apply. And so we see a lot of our customers taking the next step, which is, hey, let's bring someone in who's done this. Let's bring in a subject matter expert and speak to them about, hey, can we get a little bit more clarity and a little more specificity around that endpoint? For example, maybe I'm using MVPA. It's a very popular outcome that we see a lot of our customers use. MVPA stands for moderate to vigorous physical activity. And so you can think of this as just a threshold of activity. The higher the number, the closer to vigorous you are, the more active the patient is. Well, it's sort of a statistical binning. So you have different thresholds that qualify that activity as moderate or vigorous. A lot of times we'll bring in a subject matter expert to work with you on your specific clinical study and say, hey, what sort of thresholds should we baseline, and what sort of thresholds should we expect to see with this population? So we're getting a little bit more specific by bringing in this consultant who's done that research with that population. And many times, whatever therapeutic area you're working in, there's someone in the academic research space or even in the clinical space who can lead us down the right path. And so a lot of times we'll see a process where you have a validation plan, and that's something that a lot of studies just don't start with, right? But having that partner can help. The cons of that, I guess, are that it can cost you a little more time up front, maybe a little more money. and may not get exactly clinically significant results, but it's sort of the tier 2 validation process. And then finally, sort of the late phase sort of specific validation is often self-funded. So this is where we'll see a group partner with a university to even recruit the patients that they're going to have in the drug study. And in this case, they're often developing a specific method that will be used to validate against the primary or against the secondary endpoint for that study. And in this case, you've got an opportunity to get very specific. And this is where we see a lot of folks setting up for a label claim on a drug trial. So they'll want to have evidence is king, and so they'll want to have the most and the most specific evidence they can. And this is the best way we've seen to do that. Of course, it's costly. We have to recruit those patients. We have to pay someone to help develop the method, et cetera. But these are great approaches to starting with validation. Just a couple of slides here on what are some of the outcomes from Actigraph look like. Here's a heart failure patient that we looked at pre-surgery and then post-surgery on diuretics, and you can see the marked improvement using the SATA and Cole-Kripke algorithm that we have that is a current peer-reviewed method. And you can see the improvement in sleep. And so that was enough to support moving on to the next phase as a primary endpoint in the clinical study. And here's another view of a PAH patient during a baseline period. And so you can see one way of looking at the data is rather than trying to find a specific algorithm that matches my population and that matches my age group, I can look at baseline data and then compare that baseline data to the intervention period. And if my device is precise, if I can trust the precision of the device to consistently produce the same results, and I have proof of that through validation with the vendor, now I've got some evidence that I can support moving to the next step with the regulatory agency. And so they begin to see this data, and it supports kind of the path. I want to talk briefly about traditional versus novel approaches to patient outcomes, just to kind of give an idea. We get a lot of questions around consumer products and can we use a Fitbit or a Garmin device to measure our data? And so I think this slide will maybe help give some direction around these different approaches to patient outcomes that we see today, and then maybe where we see it going in the future. So this first graphic sort of shows the progression of how we get to our traditional outcomes. On the right, you'll see these traditional outcomes, and you all know these outcomes. These are any type of measurement that you'll see on a consumer product, calories and steps and cut points. Flights of stairs are becoming pretty popular, or some health number. These are outcomes that I think we understand as humans to be meaningful. The way that those have been historically derived, it's kind of working backwards in the graphic here, is that we have some data, we have some desired outcome, but on the left side, we have some unprocessed source signal. We have some accelerometry measure. Well, to get from the left to the right, we have to compress that data, and we have to bend that data up and then perform some regression on that data to sort of align it to a known outcome. Well, a lot of times that does get us to the number that we want, although not exactly. I believe where we'll see the future is in novel processing of patient outcomes. So rather than looking at some historically known entity around calories or steps, I think we'll see ourselves looking for different outcomes that we've not yet thought of to be related to human health and drug efficacy. So some of those we see on the right of this graphic are things like energy envelope. Am I seeing more or less entropy in my data? What about clustering of the raw data to look at walking or sitting or lying down? How do we get to those? Well, it's a little bit different. It's not a linear process. It's a novel process. And so in the middle, what we see here are machine learning methods, artificial intelligence and deep learning methods to begin to visualize or see trends in that data that stack on top of each other. And that's a different way and a different lens of looking at the data than just saying, hey, I know where I want to go with the data. Let's figure out a way to get there. In this case, we're starting with the data and what can the data give us? What type of meaning can we get out of that? And so why am I showing the slide? I'm showing it because it points to the importance of the graphic on the left, and that is the unprocessed source signal. That data is not discussed often. A lot of times we'll just sort of shovel that under the rug and say, well, it's the sensor is going to collect the data and we'll figure out how to deal with it later. But in fact, it's important to think about how that data was collected, what type of sensor was used to do that, and how that data was sampled and stored. And so just to speak to a few of those challenges, these are some things that you should consider when you buy a sensor, when you look towards sort of the drug asset and the longevity of that asset. If we're looking at 10 years, to make a drug or take a drug from concept to market, if we're looking at 2 years, but then maybe the drug asset is a 10-year cycle, right? It's post-market. We're going to look at different off-label methods or different off-label opportunities. These are some things we should consider, because in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to find that there are a completely different set of tools for looking at and examining this data. And if we've done a bad job of collecting the raw data, the unprocessed data, we're going to minimize the value in that data. So I want to make sure you guys get the maximum amount of that data. And so questions that you should consider, what is the core sample rate? Are we doing our anti-aliasing properly? Are we obeying the Nyquist theorem? What is the obsolescence plan if this accelerometer expires? What do we do? Is that same device, that same accelerometer, if I can't use it, am I going to be able to use a device that provides as much accuracy and precision as the one that's being used later? And I'm talking now about the sensor, not the actual watch. So we're talking about the subcomponents of the watch. What about the calibration method? I get asked about this all the time. Certainly a Cartesian calibration means that I make sure that the device and the sensor in the device can measure 1G vertically and horizontally and diagonally. But an anisotropic method may be better, right? Anisotropic method gives me the opportunity to look at 3 dimensions and say, hey, in any orientation that I put this device, can I be certain that it's going to give me consistent results? And so it's an important question to ask. How are you calibrating your device? How does the device handle data during low power modes? Some devices, when they go to sleep, maybe the person wearing it is sleeping, or maybe they've taken the watch off for a moment. A lot of those devices will just stop taking data altogether, assuming that any small accelerations are just noise. Well, that can be dangerous if you're looking for small signals in the signaling in the data. So let's make sure we know how it's being handled. And then how do we mitigate the logistical challenges? We're blessed to be able to partner with Signet to help with a lot of these problems, but certainly it speaks to things that we see as challenges around how do we store the data and get it moved over into the ECOA platform. Many of your ECOA platforms today are not designed for telemetry. They're designed for static measures. Give me your blood pressure when you come into the clinic once a day, or give me data whenever you come in for your visit. Having a telemetry system to get this data in real time and process it as it comes on board is going to be crucial in the days and years to come. And then how are we reducing the data? How are we going from large raw and processed data to data that we can then actually use and read with a human, in a human readable format? How's that happening, and do we have validation around that? So I don't mean to throw a lot of confusing terms, but just to make the point that as we move forward in this process, we're going to see that these questions are going to be more and more important. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Rich Sutherland to talk about the integration work that we've done with Signet. Rich?
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. So hi, everyone. My name is Rich Sutherland, and I'm a product manager here at Signet Health. And I've been working with our partners at Actigraph on our system integration. So I've just got a few slides here just to show the flow of data and the benefit to the integration of our systems. So as you can see, the top left box there represents the data collection. So you've got your touch device for ECOA, your actigraphy device for your Actigraph device for actigraphy, which then transmits the data to their hub, which pushes the raw sensor data through to their endpoint system, just as you would if you used actigraphy on any study independently. The difference then is that through our integration platform, we pull the summary outcomes data through into TrialMax, and we're able then to present that through our Trial Manager portal, which allows for data-driven notifications. These can be rules-based triggered data notifications, and we can send these direct to patient as well. And it also allows us to present the data in a consolidated reporting solution. So it gives sites and sponsors the ability to access activity, sleep, data as well as wear compliance alongside eCOA data as well. Next slide, please. So here we just cover some of the key benefits of the integration. So as a feature, we perform all enrollment activity through a single interface, and that's TrialMax. We enroll patients for both ePro and Actigraph in one single workflow and through one single system. And we have an automated integration with Actigraph's endpoint platform, which allows the creation of patients and assigning of devices. And the benefit to this is really clear. It's a much more simplified workflow for sites, and there's no need to use multiple platforms and interfaces, and it saves time for patients as well, because there's a lot less, far fewer steps to go through in order to do that enrollment. Next slide, please. So another benefit is driving endpoint quality. So as a feature, we've got our automated data-driven notifications, which can go direct to patients. We also have rule-based triggers. Some examples of that are wear time compliance being above or below a defined threshold, and at-home data transmission via the charging hub not being performed. So the benefits here are limit missing data by encouraging wear adherence, and obviously regular data transmission between clinic visits. Next slide, please. So again, driving that endpoint quality, we have a single reporting interface for eCOA and activity and sleep data, and we think this provides a number of exciting possibilities. And with regards to the benefits, it enables the oversight of eCOA data in the context of sleep and activity data. And it also simplifies the workflow for sites and sponsors, again, because they have one portal to access that patient-generated data. No need to learn multiple systems or have different logon credentials to manage. And it gives them much more rapid access to outcomes data between clinic visits to enable the monitoring of wear compliance. Next slide, please. So just some summary. So hopefully this presentation has developed an insight into how to select a mobile sensor and wearable device. If you can, and considered how to select a sensor and wearable in order to support your clinical endpoints. We've also discussed the role and importance of measuring sleep and activity in clinical trials, and highlighted the key features of Actigraph and our TrialMax integration. So I know that was a very, very brief summary of the benefits here, but I suppose one message I'd also like to drive home is that this doesn't take away from any of the service offerings of either company. It merely simplifies the flow and offers benefits of actigraphy and eCOA side by side and in one environment. So you still get the full support from both teams, and most importantly, it reduces the number of steps and actions for sites and the patient burden as well. So we're really excited about this partnership, and we've really enjoyed working with our Actigraph partners. So hopefully everyone's found this useful.
Thank you, Rich. That was super. So thank you very much. And we've come to the end of our presentation material, but would like to invite you to ask any questions. And as Dan said at the beginning, you can do that by using the control panel. And there's a questions section in there where you can type in a question. So I'm gonna moderate that. So we've got 10 minutes before we finish. So a couple of questions that have come in already. And one for you, Jeremy, maybe, well, definitely, in fact. It's a question about that validation data slide, and really just to ask, how often does data already exist for, a given therapy area or given endpoint, and how often are you seeing that sponsors are needing to do some additional work to help support that for their development programs?
Sure, thanks, Bill. Yeah, as mentioned during that slide, it's usually an iterative process. So there's almost never a specific validation study that, a specific maybe paper or publication that exists that speaks to the exact population that's being studied. But there's almost always a little bit of validation being done for general activity in those sleep measurements. And so Sometimes that's enough to get started and identify a trend or statistical change in the data. But more specificity is going to be better as we move forward to support an endpoint claim. So in that process, we often see groups that will start with the basic the endpoint that already, or I'm sorry, the validation study that already exists, and then maybe move later into bringing in a subject matter experts for consulting, maybe to get more specific on the MVPA thresholds, for example. And so, yeah, and then also remember that a lot of times the validation is more than just, is the data meaningful and does it apply to the population, and do I have the evidence to support what I'm claiming here for this population? It also includes things like wear time expectations. You know, am I expecting, how much data is the agency expecting me to get? And sometimes we don't know that until we have that first conversation around the submission with the agency. And so it's an iterative process, but there's almost always certainly something to help us get started there.
Oh, thanks. Thank you, Jeremy. And yeah, a couple of things that have come online, and I apologize for the first one. One is, what does ECOA stand for? And I know that's a term we've used a number of times in this webinar, so I'm sorry for not defining that. It's electronic clinical outcome assessments. And so we think of clinical outcome assessments, one of the categories would be patient-reported outcomes. So, you know, electronic patient-reported outcomes may be measured using a smartphone. And so when we often think about this integration with wearables and sensors, you know, it's the ePro data that we're really talking about in particular as integrating with that. And another question was just about the slides, and yes, we can make the slides available. We also make the recording of this available in the next couple of days for you. So a question for you though, Rich. Timelines. So, you know, when you're doing an integration like this with Actigraph, for example, is that going to increase the study timelines for the setup phase?
In short, no. So the timelines from both parties will not be impacted because work can take place simultaneously. So actually both project teams from Signet and Actigraph have sat down and they've outlined the process for study setup on both sides. And it was quite clear that timelines wouldn't be impacted, and there's quite a good natural fit there in terms of the setup processes.
Great, okay, thank you. A couple of questions come in around novel digital endpoints and what are the key steps for including those in drug development process, and also when will the DIA guidance on study endpoints be published? I think those two are somewhat linked because actually that work by the DIA study endpoints community really does look at all the components of not just selecting a device, but then developing an endpoint and providing the evidence to support that. We've submitted that to a journal, but it is as yet unpublished. So my hope would be that we get a good outcome, and that will be published in the next few months. But you know, who's to say? That's our target, at least, for that piece of work. Another question coming through is around yeah, regulatory acceptance, I suppose. So, you know, Jeremy, from your experience, you know, are you aware of instances where activity and sleep data, maybe the data you've collected or from elsewhere, has been used in submissions and to support drug labeling?
Yeah, great question, Bill. I don't know. I can't quote a specific study that has been used. I can tell you that Actigraph is involved in about 8 submissions through various therapeutic areas right now, and so it's growing. I mean, that's from 0 just 2 years ago, and so we're seeing a growing trend in that. This notion of using actigraphy-based endpoints for a regulatory submission and for a label claim, and I think we'll continue to see that growth as we begin to get a lot more clarity from the agency around what they expect, and as some of these guidance documents come out from CPTI, from DIA, et cetera, really defining the pathway to get from A to B. So, but yes, we're seeing that growing quite a bit.
Very good. Yeah, and there's a question here that says, are any regulatory agencies proposing guidelines to support industry adoption? And I think the only thing that I'm aware of there is the FDA's work around patient-focused drug development. And, you know, for those of you who are aware of that, you know, they're effectively replacing the PRO guidance, which was patient-reported outcomes guidance of 10 years ago. with 4 guidances around this framework for how you collect information from patients, how you determine whether things are meaningful, and then how you develop endpoints and measures based upon that. And wearables and sensors have been a big part of the discussion around that guidance. So I've been to 2 of the workshops that they've held in the last 2 years on their development guidance workshops, and they certainly they are talking about wearables and sensors. Now, whether they will feature hugely in those guidances, I don't know, but clearly it's on their mind that that those guidances would certainly refer to, or at least be appropriate for as we start to think about measurements using wearable devices and mobile sensors. Yeah, just looking through that, we've got a lot of questions here actually, and only probably time for a couple more. Rich, what does the UAT process look like? When you've got a scenario where we've got perhaps ePro as well as an integration with a sensor, so the user acceptance piece from the client. Is there extra complexity there, or different steps you need to take?
I think in some sense, if both services are being used, the integration really simplifies this, because one of the sort of main pieces that was that goes through UAT on the Actigraph side was the setup piece, and obviously Signant are sort of integrating that into the TrialMax platform. So when it comes to UAT, I think you would have a more simplified process, in that you would no longer have to conduct individual UAT with both companies, but rather it could go through one script and one sort of UAT phase. So I actually think it would be much more simple than it would if you were to have both components independent of each other.
Yeah, good. Okay, but certainly from a process perspective, there's obviously a need to coordinate the development paths of the the PRO piece and the Actigraph piece to make sure things are ready at the right time to conduct that UAT as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that goes back to sort of the discussions that both project teams have had from Signant and Actigraph, and we've sort of mapped out the timelines for both the steps that need to be taken. There's a lot of sort of synergy there, and of course our project teams will be in close contact with each other throughout the setup piece.
Yeah, good. And I think just a final interesting one, and I'll take a stab at this, and maybe Jeremy, you'll chip in as well, is about how can actigraphy endpoints obtained with different devices be compared? And I've done a little bit of thinking on this. So this idea of, could we get to a place where we're talking already about bring your own device for patient-reported outcomes? Could we come to a place where we've got bring your own wearable when it comes to activity? And some of the literature, if we look at sort of comparisons between Fitbits and Garmin's and Apple Watch, etc., in terms of their ability to measure activity, there is a big difference in the measurements between those different devices. And I think that's why, at the moment, my feeling is, select a fit for purpose device with good accuracy and precision, and and stick to using that device for your program. But Jeremy, maybe you've got a view on this as well.
Yeah, I agree with your assessment, Bill, around picking a device and sticking with it, if for no other reason, to look at the sort of the comparison, the relative change in the data over time, without introducing any variability around a new sensor and what we don't know about that sensor. But again, it just goes back to the importance. You talked a lot about standardization. It goes back to the importance of that unadulterated raw source signal. As we begin to talk about traditional outcomes of steps, and there are 1,000 different ways to calculate steps for 1,000 different groups, but it's still using the same basic sensor methodology. And so we got to talk specifically about, how is that data being collected at its very pure, source, and how do we get that data in that form so that we can use it later and duplicate our studies if this device isn't available in 2 years. So great question, and we get that often.
Yeah, good. And we've got quite a few more questions, and we'll try to answer some of these offline and respond back to folks, but we're at the top of the hour, so I just wanted to again thank you on behalf of myself and the other presenters and on behalf of Signant Health to say thank you for attending. I hope this has been interesting, and yeah, look forward to continuing to discuss this topic with you. Thank you.
Absolutely, thanks, Bill. So great presentation and an exceptionally robust Q&A. Lots of great questions. I hope everyone enjoyed this event and have taken away some new insights. If any of your colleagues have missed this presentation, once again, it will be available as a recorded archive in 1 or 2 business days, and you will be notified via email with a link to that recording. So I'd like to once again thank our friends at Signant Health for partnering with us on a great event. And I'd also like to encourage you to look for future web seminars by visiting pharmavoice.com. Thank you again for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. The event is now over.